Right, I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's live webinar from Astrix entitled Implementing a Pharma QC LIMS. Today's session is presented by Astrix and with Michael Gannon, who's a senior director here, and I'll introduce him in just a moment. And Michael, we can go to the next slide. Before we get into today's session, I'd like to take a moment to at least describe a little bit about who Astrix is, what we do in this space, and tell you a little bit about, I guess, about the background of the company. Why are we giving you this presentation? Who are we? We are a consulting company, first and foremost. We've been working for over 25 years, providing highly specialized services in life sciences. We help with process and technology, and we've become a leading partner that transforms the way science-based businesses succeed. A couple of fast facts: we were established in 1995. Vendor and platform agnostic. You'll see this today. What this means is we work with lots of different types of technology and technology vendors. We're not aligned with any one or few vendors. We work with many. We have locations in the United States and overseas, over 1,200 employees. And one thing we're very proud of is over 90% of our team members hold advanced science degrees. So we're very much a science-based company helping science-based companies. And those companies could be anything from startups to Fortune 1000. They're typically going to be life science enterprises, chemical, CPG, government agencies, research institutions. Oftentimes, if you have a laboratory, we can provide the technology stack to help automate and run that lab. So we can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of the services, so again, we're a consulting company. What does that mean? What kind of services do we provide? We provide services that accelerate digital transformation and optimize performance across your ecosystem. This means we begin working with companies oftentimes at the very beginning of their projects at the strategic innovation, enterprise architecture, where we're helping companies determine what are the business processes, what are the user requirements, what does an application and technology roadmap look like for you, and we help you through that initial phase, which is oftentimes something that companies don't have a lot of in-house skill sets to do. From there, we can help you select different vendors and solutions. So we can create RFPs for you. We can do vendor checks, vendor demos, vendor references. So we basically help you create a short list of vendors and help you evaluate them properly. From there, we can even do development and implementation. From there, we can do computer systems validation at the end of it to make sure that everything is running in accordance with regulations. We can also provide ongoing application support. We can be a tier 1, L2, and L3 support entity for you. We can also, kind of one thing that's unique is we can even help you staff your IT, or we can help you staff your R&D professionals, your laboratory professionals, et cetera. So some unique little breadth of services there. Okay, so that's a little bit about who Astrix is right now. I want to turn your attention to our speaker, so we can go to the next slide here. I'm going to introduce Michael Gannon. He's been a leader in LIMS implementation for more than 30 years. Michael was a founder of Orbis Lab Systems, and he led its growth and services across Europe and the United States. In 2023, we are very happy to have him join Astrix under an acquisition of Orbis Lab Systems. So Michael, I'm going to leave it to you from here. I'm going to sit back and enjoy the presentation. I'll come back on at the end and help with questions.
Thank you, Kevin. Good day, everyone. And thank you for that introduction. So as Kevin has said, I've been involved in the implementation of LIMS for 30 years. My background is in science, engineering sciences, and I've worked across a range of sectors, government, food, and significantly the pharmaceutical sector. And I've worked both on the development side of products, on the commercial side, and on the implementation. So today is an opportunity for me to share my own experiences in the industry and in implementing LIMS in the pharmaceutical sector, particularly QA, where most of my experience has been. As Kevin said, we are vendor agnostic, and these are the main vendors we work with. From my background, I've worked with Thermo Fisher, LabVantage, Labware LIMS, and also with Waters on Empower, mainly around the integration of that to solutions. But we're also seeing a new generation of solutions come into our market, and I will talk a little bit about that today. But these are essentially the established players, and I'd also mention Dotmatics, Benchling, and Viva. We are a certified partner of Viva, and we're very proud of that. So over my time in working with LIMS, and particularly in pharma, I've seen obviously some changes. I thought to start today's presentation, it would actually be interesting just to pick out the highlights. So around 1990, when we started implementing these solutions, primarily the systems ended up being a LIMS with a parallel paper-based system. It was quite difficult in those years to discard paper, particularly in pharma, which is so highly regulated. The paper really was the safety net. And what did the LIMS give you? It gave you control over key data. The example I always give is that ultimately you could produce a sort of analysis and stand over the data that was controlled, but it was controlled not exclusively by the LIMS, but by the paper in the lab and the LIMS. So it wasn't highly automated in those years, although we did do quite a lot of integration in different sectors. We've of course, integrated ERP to LIMS, MES to LIMS, and instruments. There was a lot of fuss as we approach year 2000 with the time issue. That drove certainly a lot of upgrades. And it was really after 2000 that customers, the market, if you will, started to press us to do more in terms of eliminating paper. And the applications developed accordingly. But I think in a lot of cases, what you ended up with was paper, notebooks were taken away. The LIMS would control the data, would provide traceability, but still people were maybe printing SOPs or viewing those on another application. We call that paper under glass because really you're operating across two systems and it's not an ideal position. The next biggest drive we saw was after 2010 with data integrity because of a number of FDA audits. And these again drove a lot of the decisions for people to maybe take the opportunity to meet that demand with a new selection of a system. And really over the last few years, and I'm coming to the present day after 2020, we are now seeing, after 20 years, a drive for data. You customers have spent a lot of money on these systems, and you expect to consume data, to be able to use it beyond producing sorts of analysis, to be able to learn more about the materials you're using, more about the processes you're following to drive the business. And so we're now in a phase where customers are asking us, how do we transform our data? How do we use our data to get better buyback on it? And one of the things Astrix do and do very well, as Kevin pointed out, I'm relatively new to Astrix, but I'm hugely impressed with the Lab of the Future process. This is essentially a blueprint that we provide customers with. If you are at the point of making a decision or you recognize that you need a new LIMS, or you're a first-time buyer of a solution like that, or even if you're starting an upgrade, it is sometimes worthwhile taking a holistic view of the lab in terms of the objectives. And if your objective is to get better use of your data, it's going to come down to decisions on a number of systems, not just LIMS. It could be down to instruments, chromatography, but how they are brought together. And we provide a blueprint for that, which is essentially a guideline, a program, followed by a set of projects. And within each program, there might be a selection of a technology, or if you've got an existing LIMS, one of the ones I've mentioned, it might be that we work with you to leverage more benefit from that system. We find that a lot of customers are never using 100% of the functionality that they bought. Some of them are actually quite low. And there is an opportunity to leverage those benefits. And this is part of the process that we try to help our customers with. One of the outputs, and this is represented diagrammatically for you for the blueprint, you'll see there on the left-hand side, the strategic plan. So we provide a strategy. We just don't dive straight into implementation. And that really is guidance about identifying your goals, your objectives, and general guidance as to how you get there. And then that will break down into a series of programs, and each program will have a blueprint. That may involve technology selection, but it will also involve establishing a team to implement the project. And then and each program will have an org chart, a methodology for the implementation. I'll talk a bit more about this later. We call that maybe a project quality plan. And then we go into execution. And it can be a series of projects in sequence, or it could be parallel projects. But we try to work in an agile manner with a series of releases in each project. And again, when we talk a little bit more about the functionality of a LIMS, I can explain what those releases might be. So what we want to get to in this digital age is to move away from simple paper on the glass and have a fully digital solution. And what I mean by that is you're using an electronic solution. You need to work not with the solution, but through the solution. And typically that will involve method execution using an LES or an ELM capability. That's what we're seeing. So that the analytic methods that you're going to use, you walk through those methods using the LIMS to guide you. You record your data, or you pull your data from the instrument as you execute that method. And so there's an element of enforcement that you follow the SOP correctly, and that's an SOP that has been fully validated, and also that the information you've entered is date and time stamped, and any metadata, not just analytic data, but any metadata you want to record, there's capability of doing that. So, in selecting a technology, there are many factors that go with that. And this is where I believe Astrix has a unique position in the market because of its agnosticity in terms of the vendors. That's the first point. And the second point is its experience. We can, in the blueprinting process, we'll identify the business requirements that you need for your solution to meet your business goals. But having done that, we're in a very strong position to identify the technologies that would work best for you. And it'll always come down to a short list of a number of those technologies. And our process is to engage with those in a framework, asking the right questions and help you make the right decision. So if you look at this diagram, if you just take right at the bottom there, the key outputs. So, coming up with a set of business requirements, of course, involves discussion with the stakeholders in your business, with the subject matter experts. And we drive that with a project manager and a business analyst. And we get a clear understanding of where you are, and we do that through a current state diagram, but also where you want to be, and that's in your future state diagrams. We will look at supporting documentation and complete requirements analysis. And ultimately, we assemble that in an RFP. That's a request for proposal that will go out to different vendors. But within that request for proposal, we have the business requirement specification. So it's a very valuable document. And in the implementation of the LIMS for pharma, that document is a governing document. It'll determine is the validation that you do and its acceptability. So it's an important document. And then we will advise on the vendors that could best meet those requirements. They're invited to answer the RFP, and we provide a methodology for scoring those responses. And also, the process goes on to engage with those vendors in terms of them showing their products by demonstration, providing references, and answering key questions. Again, we provide a scoring mechanism for this. Ultimately, you, the customer, will own that RFP. You will make the decision, but we are there with our experience to guide us. Just a couple of points on business requirements. Again, I've worked on the commercial side as well as the delivery side. And, even up to recent times, I've seen business requirements come in with a long list of functional requirements, a feature test almost. And I think without having those as-is and to-be diagrams, which we provide as part of the vendor selection, it undervalues the business requirements. Those diagrams, whether it's the flow that you want to get for your finished product samples and how you want to integrate within the manufacturing process, as you get those flows and relate the requirements to them, it's difficult to really appreciate then the functionality of the products that you're going to see in your vendor selection. So typically, and this is just a snapshot, each requirement is cataloged. I'm not going to show a 2B diagram here, but what I want to get to is that those points highlighted. What we want is the vendor, the technology vendor, to come back in their response and say whether a particular feature is out of the box, like result entry on a LIMS, requires configuration, which would be maybe a sample template or a workflow, or something that they have to customize or extend functionality for. Now they have a bearing. Out of the box functionality, we can trust that the vendor has fully tested that, and that might reduce the amount of validation we have to do. For a configuration, we're going to test that in validation using the PQ process, and I'll talk about that later. However, a customization presents something of a challenge because code may have to be written, and therefore there is a risk assessment that's needed for that, and it's going to require an operation qualification. So the vendor response to these questions has a key bearing on the overall project, in particular the validation. So in our program, and I showed you earlier, when we go to project planning and do our project quality plan, what we do in that plan is we set objectives for the project. We assign roles and responsibilities, we put in an escalation plan, we put in a communications plan, we put a project plan. Crucially, we do a risk analysis and provide contingency for the risks. We identify dependencies, and we look at your organization. So when we're doing the blueprinting, we're also assessing your organization and your ability to take on technology. And we can advise on the training and on the skills that are needed to work with us on the project, but crucially, to use the technology that you're about to invest in. But I just want to touch on these three aspects because, again, from my experience, challenges in projects occur in these areas, and there can be delays due to dependencies outside of our delivery capability, or dependencies, perhaps if we're integrating to another system, we're dependent on another vendor. But I'll start with the risk assessment. So the first one there at the top is the functional risk assessment. We follow the GAMP guideline on that, which is severity times detectability times frequency. And I go back to my earlier comments. If code is required to meet a requirement, that code is going to have to be properly reviewed. It'll have to be tested by whoever writes it, and it will have to go through an OQ process. But even if everything is out of the box or configured, you're going to set up some calculations. Some of those calculations could be, have critical impact, and you may decide to do an OQ on the calculation. Where we interface a LIMS to an ERP, to a chromatography system, or even to instruments, we do an OQ, we do an operation qualification as well as a performance qualification. And essentially what we're doing there is, because the interface is transferring data from one system to another, it's not enough just to test it from the end user point of view. It has to be tested for assurance on the data transfer itself. From a data perspective, we're looking at critical data. There's two ways of doing that. First of all, your master data. That's the data you build to describe your process. So it could be the analyses in the system. Some data have high risk, such as the analyses. And so when you change an analysis or add a new analysis, if it's a high or critical data, like an analysis, you do a test before you implement it in live. So when we implement LIMS, we have a development, a test, and a live database. And the test database or the test LIMS stays after the implementation. So when you're making changes to critical data, you can validate it in that way. Change to a calculation would be the same. Some data may be deemed to be not critical, and therefore you wouldn't go through a full validation of it. You would perhaps have an inspection plan and just ensure that the right nomenclature has been used and before releasing it for use. The project itself, the risks, from my experience, the biggest risk is the dependency we have on the organization. Of course, we have to make sure that the technology is adaptable to your users in the lab. We are reliant on them for their knowledge, but we also know they have a day job, and we have to, work within people's availability. The other example I mentioned was if we're interfacing to another technology, there would be a dependency on somebody from that side. Maybe if it's an SAP integration with LIMS, which is usually the first step done with the Pharma QC implementation, and it's identified as a key area when we're integrating ERP to the LIMS. So we're dependent on the team that manage that system for their availability. If we hit a critical bug in the implementation, that can cause a delay. So we have a relationship with the vendor, we have the right support agreement, we have the right escalation path identified with the vendor to deal with an issue like that. And then validation itself. The validation is a significant effort with a Pharma QC LIMS, and it should run in parallel with the build. But it's important that any additional scripts or scripts you're going to use have been tested, and we don't have delays because of inconsistencies there. So we will recommend in the project quality plan the type of organization you need to deliver. So Astrix, if chosen to do the implementation, which we are in many occasions having helped with the vendor selection, the type of people or the roles we engage, we have on the implementation side a lead consultant, configure, and we will do the master data build. The data and the data organization, which I'm going to talk a little bit about in a slide or two that is coming up is often underestimated. And we have particular skills there to accelerate that process. Also, we have on the technical side an architect. So you, the customer, may want to put it on-prem or in the cloud, and there's going to be integration, and our technical consultants will advise on that. And then on the validation side, we can help with the scripting and the execution. From your side, it's very important, as you know, that before you start the project, you identify someone who's going to be the administrator of the LIMS. And that person will work with us in the delivery. You will identify super users or SMEs, some of them who will work with us in designing the data, how the data is going to be structured and organized, and that could be a master data SME. From the scripting point of view, SOPs have to be written. Normally, they're written by the customer with some help from us, and the SOPs should really reflect the PQ testing, or one PQ testing should reflect the SOPs. There's a relationship there. But we need input from the organization on that. And with significant scripting, review and testing, we can help on that. IT is involved to provide the infrastructure. And then from quality, we will have standards for the validation. It can be the QA department or IT QA who will be reviewing the scripts. The scripts need to be reviewed before they're executed, and obviously have to be reviewed and signed after they're executed. When we're structuring the project, these are the key areas in building out our LIMS. Master data, the future state flows that we did, and in many of the technologies we're working with, there is workflow capability to build, to match that future state. And then there's configuration. Building workflows is configuration, but there can be additional configuration, such as templates or reports. There's validation, the infrastructure. And the last one is really important. I mentioned earlier to you that to achieve a fully electronic system, fully transformed for data, it is going to involve executing your SOPs to the LIMS. And that's going to involve a change in practice in the lab. So change management, helping you change procedure in the lab to work with a new technology is something that we're strong on. And I would recommend that in any plan. Rather than show you a Gantt, I'm just giving you an idea of the flow here. So the timeline for a fully completed QC LIMS can be 18 months to 24 months. But the way the plan is structured here, you'll see each of the tracks that I had on the previous slide coming down vertically. So you have the master data, then the future state flow, which is built by workflows, and then you have configuration. And then running in parallel is the validation process and the configuration. So, for example, when we're implementing a Pharma QC LIMS, and let's say it's a greenfield site, generally we will do environmental monitoring and product release first. So that could be release one. There might be, the first release might be environmental monitoring, second release could be product release, finished product release. Here we have a second release where we're introducing LES, ELM. This example, we've got environmental monitoring and dashboards. And the third release could be complex instruments, such as the chromatography or even the integration to SAP. So just to break from the project for a second, I'd like to just talk about some functionality that you'd expect in a QC LIMS. And this is a simple example of a login template. That's part of our configuration. And this is an example here on the right, bottom right, of an LES, where that small pane in the middle, the steps for entering data are there, and the user walks through them, and the data is recorded, and in the right pane is date and time stamp. So the traditional LIMS are pretty strong in sample management, and the samples, the raw material samples or the finished product samples, can be created by an ERP interface. We also look at retained samples. That's a key consideration, and the QC sample itself. And that's one part of the configuration. The next key one is test management. And going back to the chronology I showed you at the start of the presentation, I think some of the earlier solutions of LIMS in the pharma QC space were perhaps light in the test management capability. When you think about it, once you get a sample into the lab doesn't think in terms of the sample. The lab is thinking in terms of the method that they're going to run on that material. And so test management is very important, and it has to be strong if we're going to eliminate paper and digitize the process in the lab. And that involves not just following the method, but also controlling the metadata that goes there, like your audit trails, but also controlling what's happening in the lab. So your use of a reagent or a stock, that has to be recorded and controlled. So the LIMS should ensure that what you're using for that test is within the shelf life date, and the amount you've used is recorded. And you can go further. Is the person doing the test qualified? You qualified to do the test, qualified to use that reagent. Similarly for instruments, the instrument that you're using, there's a control, should be a control there to ensure that it's calibrated before you use it. And when you're reviewing the data, you should be able to see not just the final results, but the metadata that surrounds that, the audit trails, the stock reagent used, and the instrument used. So that brings me to data review. Typically, what we see in most labs is there's a peer review within the lab itself, and then there's a management review. But as I pointed out previously, you want traceability on all the data, and you generate a sort of analysis. The sort of analysis itself goes through a life cycle. So the search should be made available for preview and then electronically signed, recorded on the database as a record, and if it's regenerated, that fact is recorded, and you can even control who the search is sent to. And finally dashboards. SQC is quite widely used in a pharma QC, and a lot of the users I find like to be able to look at a QC chart when they're doing result review. So you can see a trend in the data. When we implement LIMS and achieve a high level of automation with instrument integration, we save 25-30% of time in the lab itself. But also the review process. If somebody today is doing data review on a paper-based system, they're having to go from a finished product log to an instrument log to a stock log. A LIMS properly implemented brings that information into one screen. And for the people doing the review and approval, it's a very significant time saver. Environmental monitoring is another area where LIMS can save a lot of time. Now, this is quite data intensive, and the plant is represented by a drawing there, you can see, but there would be locations, graded rooms, sample points, and these all need to be set up, specifications for the sample points, and then a monitoring program which is set up and runs on a calendar basis for locations, personnel, water, air, and then you have the micromethods themselves. And so what the LIMS does is it will generate a daily schedule for sample collection, and that would be by sample point, and the operator can go to the sample point. The sample will be pre-logged into the LIMS for that sample point, and the operator will have a settle plate, take the sample, and the settle plate will have a barcode on it, and will scan that plate in and scan the sample point. So that settle plate becomes linked to the sample that has been pre-logged into the LIMS. And all of that should be done without paper and just with the scan technology. And the sample schedule you see there and the room map, that should be on a mobile device, and that device should be able to work without continued access to the network, because these samples are taken in isolators, and you can't always get that connectivity. Now, where it pays off are in the trends that it produces, and ideally, and that's why this is implemented in the first phase in a QC situation with maybe a new plant, because you're able to detect trends, possible contamination using this data, and the reports, to do that manually is a very laborious exercise. So it's a big time saver here. Again, if you're coming from paper or Excel onto LIMS, there should be very significant time savings in generating these reports and trends. And typically, the LIMS will produce something like that, where you can look at a graded room and a trend for potential contamination in that room. Another data-intensive area is stability. And one of the decisions we have to make in implementing a LIMS, if you have studies that are in flight, and I know you will, stability is normally an add-on module, and because if it's a new implementation, you will decide to start new studies on the new stability module. But what about the studies that are already in flight? So if they are on an existing SQL database, we can generally create links to that existing database and report across the data. If it's in Excel, you can do links for that as well. There are tools for that. And sometimes customers may decide to actually retrospectively enter historical data to have continuity of the study in the new system. But apart from the stability, for each study will provide, like the environmental monitor, a schedule for when tests or samples are to be taken under particular conditions of packaging, temperature, and time. And ultimately, that data is used to determine the shelf life of the product. Some LIMS systems have quite comprehensive reporting with their stability module, others don't, and use third-party tools to do the shelf life analysis. So I've commented throughout the presentation on integration from time to time. So I just want to talk about this briefly. Many of the vendors we work with have innate integration capability in the LIMS. Most of them have a certified SAP interface, and that's used for creating lots, for dispositioning material. The other relatively straightforward integration are balances. And again, the LIMS should be able to pull that data from a balance. And there are ways of setting up in a lab where space is tight. We can use virtual devices to integrate the balances to the LIMS. The balance and the chromatography data we tend to find is where the biggest payoff is. And particularly in the chemistry lab, chromatography, certainly in small molecules, could be 60% of the testing they're doing. And we look at a bidirectional interface there where there's a one sequence sent from the LIMS, and then the peaks are mapped back as results onto the LIMS. And then you can select each of the other instruments on a case-by-case basis, and typically they're pH meters, FTIR, hardness testing, UV-Vis, TOC. What is emerging in the technology is the use of data orchestration. And this is a holistic integration solution that pulls and maps data from the different homogeneous or heterogeneous systems. I'll talk a little bit more about that shortly. In setting up the data for you, it does involve a level of design. So you may have a data governance program. Astrix can set one up for the LIMS or operate within an existing data governance program. What we're doing with the data is firstly organizing it by groups and subgroups for accessibility, providing it with the correct nomenclature and the correct understanding. So I just come back to data orchestration. There are tools today available on the market for managing master data, and you'll see that there on the right-hand side. These tools assist in they identify any inconsistencies in the data or any incomplete data. And if you're harmonizing your data across multiple labs or across multiple organizations, they help manage that harmonization. And so the data orchestration can map that data to the operational systems. The other side of it is if you have a data platform and you want to report across systems, you have to harmonize the data. And that typically involves an understanding of common nomenclature and structure. An example I would give that I've worked on myself is on a data platform, you might want the sample results from the LIMS, but you also might want the chromatography data from a Waters or a Thermo Fisher or an Agilent. And that data has to be pulled and mapped so that it's in a format that can go on to a data platform and the two data sets can operate together. And this is just, a view of how we create an ontology for that type of harmonization. And what's important is that we have common understanding of what is the material. I've used the term in this slide, lot. You might use batch, a sample. You want to be able to record a container, sample plan, what's a test and a test plan. So it's understanding and creating these entities on the data platform so we can map the data from the LIMS as well as from other systems, and we look at the data as a complete set. Validation, and we follow the V of GAMP, and there's the RFP or URS of the business requirements, and the PQ, very much a customer control document. We want a functional requirement spec from the vendor or ourselves implementing, and that will be tested through an OQ. Now, most customers take a risk-based approach. Whilst you will get the script as an OQ suite from the technology vendor, the LIMS vendor, they generally have to be run under a vanilla installation. And if you're satisfied, if you've done an audit of the vendor and are satisfied with the development cycle that they're following and that the out-of-the-box functionality has been properly tested, then the OQ is limited to high-risk items, such as the ones I've mentioned there, the calculations or extensions or customization. You should get templates from the technology vendor for the IQ, for the installation qualification, possibly for the OQ. And if there is for example, if we had to do an interface between two systems, between the LIMS and an existing system that you have, it's more than likely that the OQ scripts are going to have to be specifically written for that. And we would provide a template for that, or you can get the template from the technology vendor. And then there's the PQs that follow the SOP. So that's really the cycle of use on the deployed system. One thing we do recommend is before you go into validation, it's very useful to do a full systems acceptance test. Call it an informal test. It's outside of the qualification process, but it's very important that you do that so you can identify potential problems before going into validation and avoid unnecessary discrepancies or deviations. Also, any scripts that are written should be dry run. Again, that's another form of testing. So you write the script, you dry run, make sure it's consistent before it's sent for approval. And as I said earlier, the script is approved before and after execution. Training, usually 3 levels. There's a project team, and the level of training there is important, again, for common terminology. It's very important everybody speaking the same language. End user training is usually based around the SOPs, can be online. And then there's advanced training for your system administrator. That can happen during or after the project. So just to bring matters to a conclusion before the questions and answers, I just want to come back on the main points that I've covered here today. I think the blueprint, if you get the opportunity to do it, is very valuable, even if you're upgrading, to take a view of the system, what your goals are. I'm sure for most of you it will be digital transformation, but also to take the opportunity to see what technologies are out there, and we can help advise you on that. There's the selection process for a technology and an implementation partner. And I come back to the point that, we've been doing QC LIMS for more than 30 years, and therefore most of the features that a QC lab requires should be out of the box. Maybe it should be standard rather than out of the box, I would say. And then we're seeing these new technologies for data management and harmonization, which really save a lot of time. And, in talking to customers these days, I find one of the biggest issues they have is their data. If you've had a LIMS for some years, data becomes organic and almost grows. But that data can be straightened out, and these tools can help, or our guidance can help there. And then the validation effort, it is significant, but it can be optimized time-wise based on a solid risk assessment. And what really underpins all of this is experience. Our experience of having been through these cycles, we can preempt potential problems. All of this, an integrated system, a fully digital system, has been done before, and we're here to guide you. And I think at that point, I'll conclude short of the questions and answers.
All right, great. Are we wrapped up on the presentation side then, Mike?
We're finished on the presentation side, yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, great. I think there's a next slide, maybe, if you can go to that.